Good evening, Facebook land. It's been a pretty unique kind of, 24 hours for the Victorian Parliament. So we have two MPs from the Liberal Democrats in the Victorian Legislative Council doing a live stream tonight to answer any questions and explain what's happened in the past 24 hours, really. My name's Ash Blackwell. I work in David Limbrick's office. I'll be handling your questions. I've got them open on another screen here. So if you post questions in the live feed, my role tonight will be to kind of moderate and flick these guys some questions. So tonight we've got Tim Quilty, member for the Northern Victorian region, Victorian Legislative Council, and David Limbrick, member for the Southeast Metropolitan region of the Legislative Council. So I guess let's just start with what happened today with the sitting. There's been a lot of talk in the media about MPs breaching the Chief Health Officer's rulings and, various comments. Could you explain a little bit about exactly what happened today?
Yeah, well, I'll start with that. So yesterday we had, there was a emergency meeting called to try and discuss, from the government with the crossbench and opposition parties on, what we're going to do today. And I think the government wanted to delay today's sitting. They had some advice from the Chief Health Officer saying,
They wrote some advice.
Yeah, sorry?
They wrote some advice for the Chief Health Officer.
Well, I don't know exactly what happened, but they had some advice that said, it would be prudent to delay. Wasn't a direction. I don't think that the Chief Health Officer can actually direct. And so we got that advice. I think we got it about 3 p.m. yesterday. So, a lot of the regional MPs were already in the city and, it was a bit of a mess. But anyway, after meeting with the government and everything, we came to the conclusion that you can't actually delay because there's no real mechanism through which you can delay Parliament because there was a hard date. So we had to sit. So whatever the government was saying about delaying is nonsense.
The government's plan was for us just not turn up, but that doesn't work. What happens in that situation is the chair comes in and they ring the bells for half an hour. If no one turns up, he has to go away and come back tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow indefinitely until quorum is met. So It was a nonsense plan.
It would have been funny actually if the bells are ringing every day and no one's here and I don't know, but I suppose a group of people.
That would have been the alternative if Parliament didn't sit and formally adjourn for 2 weeks and delay the next sitting. That's essentially would have been the default position, what you just explained there, Tim.
That's be waiting. Yeah,
that's my understanding. Yeah.
The government claims it's because of the lockdown and health advice, but really they didn't want scrutiny, as far as I'm concerned. They didn't want the Parliament scrutiny, and they were desperate to do anything about it. They could cancel the lower house, stop them being questioned, but the upper house they just didn't have the power. So they were trying every trick they could to try and make it happen. A CHO, far from it for me to question his independence. However, I feel like he's just happily done exactly what the government wanted here with his advice. He doesn't have the power to tell us not to come. He'd be breaching parliamentary privilege. So he just advised the regional MPs not to turn up.
But that advice, Tim, only came through yesterday afternoon when many of the regional MPs were already sitting. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Well, not already sitting, but already in Melbourne.
I normally drive down early Monday morning. I didn't yesterday because I was waiting to hear what's going to happen, but most of the other regional MPs had. That was rubbish. The government's had weeks to plan it, but at the last minute, as usual, they go, "Oh, hang on, upper house too. We can't control that."
Yeah, it was pretty disappointing that there was this story in the paper yesterday saying how the upper house is defying the CHO. I mean, I think this was all planned yesterday. I get the feeling that they planned to have a go at people for turning up, but in reality, we had to sit. I mean, I don't know of any other way that this could have happened. If we hadn't turned up, we would have ended up with that Groundhog Day scenario, which is crazy. So
the government's second plan was to sit for 5 minutes and send everyone home again. But they couldn't get the numbers for that. So they went to plan C, which was sit for 1 day, which is what we did.
Mm.
And so this motion to postpone Parliament from today was debated this morning. What was the kind of tone of that debate this morning?
Probably the best speaker on it was Catherine Cummings. She tore a strip into the government over it. Basically, so the motion was that we'll sit for 1 day and then we'll postpone. Theoretically, we'll come back in 2 weeks, but in practice, we'll come back when the government chooses, or when the president chooses, which will be when the government chooses. So I don't expect to sit for at least 6 weeks now. So I don't think anybody on the opposition or the crossbench were overly impressed by that. At least nobody who spoke about it was. It's just an attempt to avoid scrutiny as far as I'm concerned. It's not like there's a big health risk here. We're all distanced. The government was making a big thing about following the CHO and how we're evil for not following the CHO. The CHO, they call him. The CHO. But rubbish.
So there was one comment in here, and you could clarify this, was just, lol, did you pass any legislation? So what did happen with that?
No, so the government did have some bills up that they wanted to pass. One of them actually we were very supportive of. This was extending the drug court, but the government just pulled all the bills. They were still there, but they didn't debate any of it. So the only things that actually happened today in Parliament is they had some formal business. They had question time, which was interesting as well, and some other like adjournment mechanisms and things like this. But it went for less than 3 hours total. So, and there was no legislation passed. There was a few reports tabled and stuff like that, but it was not particularly eventful apart from the debate at the start and question time, which was interesting.
And why was question time interesting? What happened during question time?
Yeah, well, the government made a big point about not having many of their MPs in Parliament, which, that's fine. That's their right to do. But they did have the health minister there. And
they left most of their ministers behind as well, not just the MPs.
Yeah, not just the MPs. It was most of the ministers as well. But they did have the health minister there, Minister Makakos, which was good because, most of the questions were probably going to go to her as well. And in fact, my question was to the health minister as well. I thought I had a very salient question about, what was actually happening at the moment with the lockdown and what we're doing with their strategy. But what ended up happening, which was pretty outrageous actually, was that the minister just refused to answer any questions and took everything on notice and said that she'll give a written response tomorrow, which is the first time I've ever seen that happen. The minister does have the right to answer a question on notice, but it's usually only used if the question's not really something that they can answer right then and there. So it might be something that, a technical piece of data or something that they just can't know off the top of their head, or maybe they need to refer it to another minister in the assembly or something like that. If it's something that's within their area of responsibility and, they should be on top of it, they usually answer it. And, the minister didn't come in with notes or anything, so she had no intention of answering any questions from the start by the look of it. It
just shows what's behind the whole attempt to cancel the Parliament. They didn't want to answer questions. So it just ripped off any wrapping paper that was covering it up. The government did not want to have to answer questions to MPs, and when they were forced to, they just sat there and said, no, we're not answering. I'll answer in paper, and then it'll disappear for 6 weeks until the crisis is over and we're the heroes again.
Well, the minister did commit to giving us an answer tomorrow, so we'll wait and see if that happens.
But that's after the media opportunity is over, so the papers won't report on it.
Yeah,
It all disappear into a black hole.
Yeah. So, I mean, I thought my question was, important. I was asking about a couple of things, actually. So the first one, let me just get a copy of it up in front of me. I should have got that earlier. So it was basically around the harms. So one of the questions was around, okay, if we've got a spectrum of harm, if the government does nothing in response to the pandemic, then we'll have harms caused to people because there will be, the disease will shorten people's lives. But then on the other end of the spectrum, if the government does really, really extreme lockdowns and things like this, then we have this problem where there's other harms caused, which can also affect people's life expectancy. Things like, the health system will be crowded out by the pandemic. There will be people who will be poorer, which affects life expectancy. They'll have worse mental and physical health from, being locked up for so long. Some people, unfortunately, have committed suicide. I mean, there's all these other issues. And of course, poverty over the long run reduces the ability to fund the health system in the first place. So, of course, there's lots of harms here. And I asked about the modelling that the government had done to look at those harms. The other thing that I was interested in is right from the start, the government has been talking about flattening the curve, flattening the curve. And the whole rationale for doing that was to, and this was a reasonable rationale, was to make sure that the number of people who needed hospital care wouldn't exceed the total capacity of the hospital, which, is fine. Like, I mean, we accepted that. We said, yeah, okay, that's a reasonable thing. But what's weird is that the total capacity utilisation of the hospitals has actually been pretty low. So I just don't get what the rationale is for upgrading these security things when the number of hospitalisations is very low. And so I asked about that, and we'll wait and see what the response is tomorrow, I suppose. But
there was a question. I think it's related to that, David. I think requesting that the answer to that question be published, is that something that we can do?
Yeah, absolutely. So, we've been promised to get it tomorrow, and I'll publish it as soon as I get it. So, yep. And if I don't get it, I'll let people know that too.
Yeah. There was another I do want to get more into exactly where we're at with the pandemic. And this comment, I think, might lead us in that direction. If I'm understanding it correctly, and I'm not sure if I am, it's a concern about I think running out of money to fund the current approach, like across the longer term. So what, a concern that like we've kind of bought this expensive car and now we've got to pay for the maintenance on it. How do you guys feel about that?
Well, the current, you go ahead, Tim.
Federal government can obviously just print money to pay for it. The state government doesn't have that option. We're going to just run up debts and struggle to pay them. It's problematic.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's clearly not sustainable what we're doing now at any level. Sooner or later, it's going to fall apart. Now, how long it's sustainable for, we don't know. I don't know off the top of my head. I'm sure people can figure that out, and people have differing views on that. But it's clearly not sustainable when you have so many people being forced out of work. And let's be clear, it's not the pandemic that's forcing people out of work. It's the government's response to the pandemic. Now, whether or not that response is justified, people can have their own views on that. But it's clearly not sustainable over the long term. Now, the state government, when they raise debt, they have to issue bonds. They've been doing that. My understanding is, they've got lots of capacity to issue more bonds, but, there's limits on everything, right? So they can't just keep borrowing forever. So yeah, it's not long-term sustainable.
They were already blowing their budget before this happened. The bushfire crisis blew the budget, and there was going, how are we going to cope with that? Now this has come along, and it's like just an excuse for the government to spend. They're not even no one's checking, no one's worrying about it. The budget process was cancelled in April, so when we come back in October, the government's going to say, here's the budget, pass it or don't pass it, we don't care. And just keep rolling on without no scrutiny.
And this idea that, lots of people have been talking about this idea of, saving lives versus saving the economy. And I think what people don't realise or get, or maybe they're just not being genuine about it, is that the economy is people's lives, right? The economy is some interaction of all the needs and desires of people. It's the economy is people cooperating for the good of each other. And the economy is also how we fund the health system. So, if you kill the economy over the long run, you kill the health system as well. You can't have a health system if you're bankrupt, right? So this idea that there's this dichotomy here is really wrong. And I think they've been demonizing people who, question that. They say, well, why do you want to kill grandma or something? This is what sort of people have been saying. But I think the reason that they're demonizing people is because if they're wrong and, more people are being hurt by these long-term effects, then, they're the bad guys, right? So I think that's what it comes down to. They've just got this sort of default reaction to demonize people. And there's been a lot of that, which,
I mean, I think it's obvious now they've made a mistake with the whole approach to the pandemic, the lockdowns, everything, and it's going to cost money. But if they were sensible, they'd say, let's back it off now. Let's just go back to normal. But they're not going to do that. They're going to double down in an effort to pretend they didn't make a mistake, and it's going to make it worse. But as long as the public don't blame them, just blame the virus, it'll be all good.
Yeah,
so government can always default on its debts. So is that down the track?
Yeah, I mean, there's this sort of idea here that we should only be listening to the medical experts. But the problem is, if you give a medical expert the objective of saving lives with unlimited resources and unlimited power, their response will always be lock everyone up, right? Because that will save people, right? It's the same as if you gave a road safety expert unlimited power and no consideration of other things. You said you have to lower the road toll to 0. They're going to set the speed limit to 4 kilometres an hour or something, right? So this is the way it's going to work. But of course, there's other considerations here. There's other harms caused over the longer term by this that need to be considered. And this is, I really don't feel like all of the voices have been heard here about some of these harms that they're talking about. And the government's clearly aware of some of these harms because, one of the harms is that people haven't been going to the hospital to get checkups and things like this for other problems that they've got because they're scared of catching the disease or whatever. They think the hospital's not running, or I don't know what they think, but lots of people haven't been going to get checkups and things like this. And this is going to compound into health problems down the track that,
So would a way of summarising that be that when the government talks about being informed by the evidence, that they're only being informed by one kind of evidence?
Well, it's hard to know what evidence they are being informed by.
They won't tell us.
Yeah, they won't really.
Won't release the information. Well, I had a point. I lost it again.
This was raised in the chamber today, I believe, Tim, from the opposition, trying to get details of exactly what the health advice has been to the government to justify these decisions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We heard during PAYAC hearings, and I thought it was good because we did get, during the last PAYAC hearings, I was asking the CHO about, there was a talk at the time about, golf and fishing, and they were recommending that, that they made directions that people weren't allowed to go golfing or fishing or hunting, right? And I asked about that, what is the modelling around the risks associated with those activities? And the response was, well, there is no real modelling, so there is no real evidence around it. What it's actually, someone's got a bit of sound there. What's actually going on is that they're taking this precautionary approach, and so it's really, and the word that was used was, arbitrariness. So, they say, well, we don't know the modelling or the risks for this particular activity, but if we lower all activity, then we'll get the overall risk down, which is true, but it also means that you're causing massive effects on people's lives, and you're not really looking at proportional risk weighting for different activities. Going fishing by yourself, your sensible common sense view would be that it's not particularly risky, right? So
we've made the point before that the restrictions have to be reasonably necessary, and if they haven't got any modelling behind it, and if they admit it was arbitrary, it's not reasonably necessary, it's an illegal instruction.
Well, their get out there, though, was, it actually says in the legislation, and this is what they said in PAYAC, is the get out clause there is that they do not have to, the CHO does not have to rely on complete scientific evidence to make a decision. They can use a precautionary principle and act with it with incomplete information. And that's how it's legal. Because I thought the same thing myself, this doesn't look legal. They don't have any evidence, but there is a get out clause there. So, yeah.
So we've got one more question that's a little bit technical, and I will come back to the question on airsoft, unless you want to jump in on that, Tim, in addition to this other question. And it's related to somebody, Daniel Baker, said that they saw a article that the upper house defies the CHO, and they were quite keen on that. But they followed that with a question, and the question was, why can't Parliament convene over some form of technology?
Good question.
We could, but we don't have the standing orders to do it. So all our committees have been, over the last few weeks or months, have been meeting online. So we've been having deliberative meetings when everyone's on computers. So it can be done. The Parliament itself is not set up for people to meet online, and we don't have the rules passed for it. We could have passed some today, but we didn't do that. We have to be sitting to pass some rules to say that we can meet online, and it hasn't happened yet. They tell us there are technical difficulties. If some people are in the chamber and some people are online, it would probably work better if everyone was online, but I don't think they're considering that option. Maybe one day. The reason in the past that they haven't allowed absentee votes or anything else is because you don't know if someone's being coerced. By having everyone present in the chamber, which is guarded, making sure there's no one holding a gun at someone's head to make them vote. So that's the historical reason behind it.
Which is a legitimate concern, which they need to address. I mean, there's technical and legal issues around all this. I mean, I'm not convinced that they're insurmountable, though. I think, Tim, you probably agree. I think they can do this. I mean, even if people just stayed in their office like we are now at Parliament, they would all be isolated from each other, and that would be a highly secure environment that you could be confident that people weren't being duressed within Parliament that way. If they were from their home or something, that might be a bit more difficult. But I mean, there's problems with it. That they would need to overcome. But yeah, I'm not convinced that they're insurmountable. I think it's possible to do it somehow.
It'll ruin the cross-chamber interjections.
Yes, it would. I'm not sure how interjections would work at all. There'd be a whole bunch of cultural things that would not.
You have to type them up.
Yeah. But yes, they are talking about it, and Parliament staff are really good and been doing their best to try and come up with solutions for this sort of stuff. But it's technically challenging, and legally there's issues as well. But they are still working on it, and hopefully we'll get something that's possible. But it's not there yet.
Yeah,
committees are working remotely though. Committees, they've done all that, and that actually works okay. Yeah, it's
funny. At the end of last year, we had the standing orders to let the committees work remotely, and I wanted to do that from my Wodonga office instead of travelling down for meetings. And they said, "Oh, it's too hard. We can't do it." But then the coronavirus came along, and suddenly we're all doing it. So maybe it'll happen again with the Parliament at some point.
Lost my train of thought there. I was about to jump into something. I was going to say, just for the people watching on the live stream, just keep your comments or questions coming in. We'll try and get to all of them if we can. A little bit technically challenging. We've got them coming up on 3 different pages, but we're trying to keep an eye on all of them. While I have another look to see what kinds of things that people are saying, I believe you both had something to say about the, I guess what the government would call their enhanced enforcement measures for coronavirus that were brought in today. What do you guys think about the new fines and the, I guess, stronger approach from Victoria Police?
It seems to me that the government never learns. They've been trying to find their way out of the crisis for months now, and all they're doing is losing the goodwill of the people. Every time being heavy-handed doesn't work, they up the ante and go more heavy-handed, and then they abuse us for not following their instructions. They need to keep the goodwill of the people instead of beating the people. But for authoritarians that don't understand the idea, I think we should just comply.
You can't. Tim's right. You can't find your way out of a pandemic, and I think what they've been doing with just ramping up this policing, even though we've had more fines than any other state, and yet we've got the worst results. Just seems like they're not sort of willing to try any other approach other than getting a bigger stick to hit people with, which is really concerning and dangerous. And my biggest criticism, since the start really, is they don't even seem to be trying voluntary compliance or trying to educate people. I mean, the masks was a great example of this. There was lots of people pushing for better advice around masks, including myself, because they do serve some purpose. They lower risk, and they're generally useful. We've seen them used successfully in other countries like Taiwan and Japan and lots of these other Asian countries. And instead of an education campaign to show people, what masks are, how they work, what situations they're good for, what are their limitations, what they're not good for, all of that sort of stuff, they just said, tomorrow or Wednesday next week, you got to wear a mask or you get a $200 fine in all outdoor situations, and here's how you put one on. And of course there was people that rebelled against that. Initially there was people, they tried to demonize them, say, these are anti-mask crazies or whatever. But then, that gets that group just gets bigger, right? Because then there's other people, a very rational person will be walking down the street all by themselves with a mask on their face, and they'll be going, why am I doing this again? Because in that situation, it's not helpful. And so my real concern there is that rather than you having effective mask use, what we've got is masks being used just for compliance. So people just want to not get the fine, so they do whatever it takes to not get the fine, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're using masks effectively. So I was very concerned about the way that they brought that in, and it was just straight in with the authoritarian stuff. And then afterwards, they tried to explain why people should use it. I mean, after you bring in a mandatory law, why are you trying to convince people of something that you force them to do? It's...
And obviously at the start they were saying masks don't work, don't wear a mask.
Yeah, well, that's a whole other issue. The mixed.
They had a shortage of masks, and they didn't want people wearing them, so they're running around. They don't work. Don't do it. You're an idiot wearing a mask. And then suddenly, bang! They've changed their mind. Everyone wear a mask or else.
When they
announced,
and then demonise people who a week ago they would have been saying they're idiots for wearing a mask, and now they demonise them as anti-mask crazies or something. It's just all over the place. And
just got the whole approach wrong. When they announced masks for regional Victoria, we're sitting there listening to Dan Andrews waffle on, as he does, on and on, before he gets to the point. They said, all right, someone go out and buy a box of masks from the chemist next door. They sold out in under an hour, all the chemist shops in Wodonga. No more masks available. Got to ease us into it. The whole approach, it's just nonsense. I get really irritated with the way they do stuff. They could have just said, wearing a mask is a good idea. We encourage you to wear a mask.
Yeah. I mean,
So we've got a question on that, and I think you might have answered it, but maybe just to make sure. The question was, what's your alternative to this heavy-handed response?
Yeah, so I want education and voluntary compliance. So, and we've seen other countries do this. So in the example that I've been using is with masks is Japan. Now, admittedly, they already had a culture where they wore masks, right? So it wasn't a big jump for them. But one of the things that they did is on television, they had a great big education campaign and they showed how masks work and why they're effective. And they had these really convincing demonstrations. They said, you know, masks will protect other people from your sneezes and stuff. They won't necessarily protect you from anything. If you wear one, you're helping stop transmission to other people. And they asked people to wear one. They sent them out in the mail so that everyone had one. So everyone just got one in their letterbox. There's no such thing as fines. Like no one had any fines or anything like that. And they've been using them for ages. So, I mean, you know, why didn't we even try? And this is the crazy thing, right? Before it became mandatory. So on the Wednesday night, it became on the Wednesday night that it became mandatory. I think it was that morning, the Premier did a press conference. So he'd already announced that evening it was going to become mandatory. And when he was at the press conference, he said, "Oh, I'm really glad to see that I'd estimate about 80% of people are already wearing masks." And it's like, he's already got 80% voluntary compliance without these fines, right? And, you know, with a bit of nice education and social, you know, social pressure and things like this, they could have got that up much higher, I think. So, but whenever they've come in with any of these mandatory things, there's always been unintended consequences, right? We saw it when they first announced the lockdown. Everyone panicked and went and bought food. And then, of course, that's a natural response, right? You're like, how long do I have to stay at home? I need to feed my family and stuff. So people went and bought a lot of food, and it's totally understandable. They demonized them as hoarders, right? They attacked these people that went out and bought food for their family, right? With the masks, like, people panic. They're like, I don't want to get a fine. So they go out and buy all the masks, and then people in regional Victoria can't buy a mask. And then with the curfews, like, they've got this other thing with the curfew, like, you know, if the curfew's at 8 p.m. and let's say, for example, you finish work at 6 p.m, you've squeezed everyone's shopping into a 2-hour window. Now, you know, you might be able to do online shopping or whatever, but I mean, this is just one example of these unintended consequences. When they announced a metro lockdown area, they said, oh yeah, in a few days, we're going to do this lockdown. Everyone went away on a holiday, or there was like traffic jams out to the Mornington Peninsula. I mean, every time they've done one of these things, there's been this unintended consequence, which should have been predictable if you think about people's behaviour. And then they demonise the people that do this. They call them, you know, COVIDiots. They call them, you know, anti-maskers or hoarders. This way that, you know, this staying apart keeps us together thing, they're dividing our society over this stuff. It's absolutely outrageous what they're doing.
And I think also people are getting very angry with the ongoing restrictions and the fact that it keeps going. Some of the anti-mask protest is not about wearing a mask, it's about telling the government to fuck off.
I mean, people don't like being bullied. I mean, that's what this is, like, especially by the government. I mean, it's not sustainable, right? You can't use a big stick forever. Like with the masks and the social distancing, these are cultural changes. You can't, if you try and impose culture with a stick on top of the population, there's always going to be people that will rebel against that. It's not sustainable, I don't think.
So what about this 8 p.m. curfew then? I'm sure you have some views on that.
Yeah, well,
shock and awe, they call it. Shock and awe. Let's do something with absolutely no justification to make everyone think it's serious and take it seriously. So what can we do? What can we do? Let's have a curfew because the virus spreads more at night. It's bloody nonsense.
Yeah, I mean, this is another one of those things. I mean, there's no direct evidence of, you know, transmission at night and stuff. They've just said, oh, well, we want to lower everyone's activity overall, so we don't need to model the exact risk or whatever. I mean, I don't know what sort of modeling they're doing behind the scenes, but it just seems like a way to lower everyone's risk. And make the policing simpler, right? And a lot of these things have been, because they're relying on a policing approach, the policing is very complicated, right? If you see someone not wearing a mask on the street, there's a whole bunch of legitimate reasons why you might not be wearing a mask. Some people have got lung conditions and allergies and, all sorts of things. It's the same with going out at night, right? But if you remove a lot of the reasons that someone is allowed to go out at night, you can sort of just start pulling people over and giving them fines and things like this. It makes the policing a hell of a lot easier. And I think that's a lot of what they're doing. No one thinks that the virus spreads any differently at night, but, there's already unintended consequences of this. You're crowding people into a smaller time frame where they can do the activities that they're still allowed to do, which isn't many. But just the idea of having a curfew. I mean, we didn't even have a curfew during World War II.
They're conditioning us. So if there's a crisis, an emergency, we must do this. And now we've done it once. People know there's curfews. I'm not proposing a conspiracy theory that the government is planning to take over the country. But the way government works is they just gradually expand their powers. And now they've done this once, they'll do it again. And next time they'll go a bit further because they can. It'll be convenient at the time. And that is how liberty is lost. One slice at a time.
So, I mean, our role in all this is to, question what they're doing. And, that's the whole point of Parliament being there. That's the whole role of providing scrutiny, in this sort of situation. And, Parliament's being suspended now for, apparently 2 weeks, but probably a lot longer than that. We still have the Public Accounts and Estimates Committee hearings next week so far, but who knows, I might get a phone call over the weekend and that'll be cancelled too. I don't know. I'll be very upset if that's the case. But, there needs to be a light shone on the decisions that they're making. And, people might criticize us and say, well, you guys are just, picking at the government. Why don't you just get behind the government? Well, it's our job to question what they're doing. That's our job. And I think
particularly when they're stuffing up.
In
this whole second outbreak is the government screwed up the quarantine process. They had dodgy security guards apparently bonking the guests and spreading the virus, and everything they're doing, I think, is as much about deflecting the blame from themselves as it is about controlling the disease. If they lock us up long enough, they might show they're tough again and get out of jail from how they screwed up before.
I think it's just so awful the way that these bad guys are being created and demonized by the government. They come out with these lists of, all these people that have done these things wrong or whatever. And, when you look at what they've done wrong, they've gone to visit a friend or something. And, there's sort of no compassion here whatsoever for people's circumstances or anything like that. They just, make these authoritarian rules, and anyone who doesn't do what they say is the bad guy, and they're gonna demonize them. And I just don't think it's a good way of it's not going to be a sustainable thing. Like, more and more people are going to get fed up with it, and they're not going to put up with it, I don't think.
We've got a question from Jack. Hang on, let me go back to it. What are the actual requirements for declaration of a state of disaster? So I've got the legislation in front of me if you don't know off the top of your head.
I don't know off the top of my head. I know
I can read it out and you can respond with
so I know the medical. I know the medical one. The state of disaster is I know it's a lot more powerful, but I'm not sure of the actual requirements off the top of my head.
So if I'm reading it correctly, under the Emergency Management Act, clause 23(1, quote, if there is an emergency which the Premier of Victoria, after considering the advice of the Minister and the Emergency Management Commissioner, is satisfied constitutes or is likely to constitute a significant and widespread danger to life or property in Victoria, the Premier may declare a state of disaster to exist in the whole or in any parts of Victoria. So that's it, that little bit.
It's pretty open-ended, isn't it?
Pretty much, if they want to do it, they can do it.
Yeah, pretty much.
I'm increasingly going off the idea of these.
Yeah. So I don't think, I think that maybe when it was drafted, people didn't necessarily expect it to be used quite in this way. Just to complete the answer for Jack there, I don't have the section in front of me, but they do have to table a report in Parliament on how the powers are being used, and this was done with the emergency declaration as well. No, it was done for the disaster declaration for the bushfires.
And they didn't do that today. So the opposition kicked up a big stink because there was meant to be a declaration or something tabled in Parliament today, and it wasn't. So yeah, I don't know what the consequences of that are, but it wasn't tabled.
Declaration's not legal.
Interesting point. I don't know. We might need a better lawyer than me to figure that out. But it seems strange that there's a requirement to table it, and it said, I think the legislation from memory says at the first available opportunity, which would have been today, you would think. So I don't know.
We've got a bit of a longer one here, and let me see if I can get it correctly. I don't think the government is competent enough to plan conspiracies, etc. But the level of inconsistency, I think, causes many otherwise rational people to wonder what on earth is going on. Conspiracy theorist groups will attract many more people if they aren't already, and I think it's a very scary prospect. And they're concerned that we may see riots like the USA is seeing. And that's the last thing anyone wants. So I guess, what are your thoughts on that? Like, do you think there's a potential for that level of disruption on the streets if this drags out and these groups kind of keep meeting? And
I think yes. I think people are people talking about depression and other mental health problems. Anger is going to grow. It is growing already. I know up on the border there is absolute fury with. It's probably targeted more at the New South Wales government than the Victorian one on both sides of the Murray about the border lockdown. I don't think the New South Wales Premier understands what she's unleashed up there. She might have a couple more seats being lost. They've been losing seats along the border already, but they've got a couple of safe seats here that might be disappearing as well. People are furious. There's a massive level of anger, and it's going to come out in the anti-mask protests, conspiracy theories, riots. Sooner or later, the fury will erupt. I think a bigger reason for the BLM riots in America was the fury of people being locked up and losing their jobs and all the issues that go with it. And I think sooner or later we'll see the same things happening.
Yeah, look, I think a lot of this is driven by the fact that they haven't gone for any sort of voluntary compliance approach, and they've used mandatory compliance with everything. And one of the really bad unintended consequences of that is that you validate people who feel, if you have like a conspiracy theory group or whatever, they always have this sort of victim thing, right? So they want to feel like they're a victim. And when you outlaw their choice, then you validate their pre-existing views and cause them to grow, because then they can say, well, look, we told you this was going to happen. We told you they were going to make these things mandatory, and look at what happened. We were right. And, people believe it, and then it grows from there. And I think this is just another unintended consequence. Whereas if they had have gone for a voluntary compliance approach, none of that would have happened, because you would have had these anti-masker groups and people would have said, yeah, but no one's forcing you to wear one. So what are you complaining about? It's your choice. So, it would have just fizzled off, right? Because there's no validation going on there.
We've got a couple of comments here that are, I think, along a bit of a similar line. So one is around the number of people that are just really championing the lockdown and the curfews. They're super fans of it. And the other comment, which is kind of related to that, is on social media, the kind of, one-sided glowing praise for anything that the government does or that the Premier does. And I think both people are in both different contexts were quite concerned about this level of like buy-in for anything that the government does, and I guess have concerns about that. Do you guys have some thoughts on that?
I mean, I think we've got people. If you promise people safety, if there's a terrible threat, I'll save you. People climb on board. When I was younger, I used to wonder what the hell happened in totalitarian regimes in the 20th century. How do ordinary, rational people suddenly go to supporting these groups? I think here we're seeing an example of how it's done. There's a disaster. Government must have more power to fix it. Everyone's going, yes, save me, take the power, take my freedom. Obviously, there are a large chunk of the population that are perfectly happy to be saved at the cost of their freedom.
Yeah, there's a few things going on. I think some of it is just, you know, old-fashioned tribalism, right? If they'll just, you know, they see themselves as supporters of, you know, the government or against the government, and they do whatever their tribe is doing, and you end up with that sort of thing, and not really rationally questioning the actions that the government might be taking. And I think that's a big issue. And, you know, people are scared, and so they want someone to save them, like Tim says. But a lot of the fear is actually generated by the government itself. Like they go out there and they try and scare the wits out of people with these stories about, you know, how you're going to die. It's not just old people, like everyone dies from this. And, you know, there's also, and then they're talking about all these horrible long-term consequences of getting the virus and all this sort of thing. And, you know, like, of course, no one wants to get the virus and no one wants to die from it and all this, but they need some sort of, you know, proportionate way of presenting these things. You know, there's risks, there's all sorts of risks in life, and none of this is proportional. They're just focusing everything on this one problem and using fear as a way to get compliance and get Victorians turning on each other, which is the thing that really upsets me the most out of all of this, is seeing people demonize each other and dobbing their neighbors because they visit a friend and like this sort of thing. Like, it's a really, really awful place that we've gotten ourselves into now.
I sometimes think the easier our lives become, the less we're willing to tolerate any dangers or any risks. I think it's probably an inevitable process of as our lives get longer and safer, we get more and more attached to them and less willing to risk anything. And it's an issue we'll have to address going forward. But it's certainly, people from 100 years ago wouldn't recognise our societies at all, for the better or the worse.
I think it's disappointing as well how few politicians have challenged this. I mean, even, you know, you'll see politicians will argue with the government and say, you're not going hard enough, like you should be doing more. It's like, you know, I sort of feel like in a lot of ways, us challenging what they're doing here and, you know, and defending the principles of freedom is, you know, I feel like we're like the last men on earth in some ways. It's pretty lonely sometimes, but, you know, I still believe in what we're doing. It's our role to defend the principles of freedom, and, you know, someone's got to do it, right? So that's our job.
Another, I guess, technical question around the emergency and disaster declarations. Can the government extend the state of emergency or the state of disaster?
Okay, so the state of emergency, so this is the medical emergency, they could run that for a maximum of 6 months. So I'm not sure exactly when that was due to finish. I think it was at the end of September. Maybe I'm wrong on that, but so we were discussing a while ago, you know, how they might, if they need these powers beyond September, what are they going to do? And we decided way back then that they're probably going to use a disaster declaration, which is exactly what they've done, because it's a separate set of emergency powers. It's different to the emergency declaration because the emergency declaration gives lots of power to the chief health officer, whereas the disaster declaration, correct me if I'm wrong, Ash, gives it to the Minister for Police, effectively. Yeah,
I believe so. Yeah.
It's a different power. It's much more. The disaster declaration is much more extreme power. It gives the government the ability to take control of property. It gives them rights of entry without warrants. It gives them the ability to appoint people, authorize them to, I think even PSOs can enter homes or something under these powers. I haven't checked that, but like there's some pretty serious stuff. Whereas the under the emergency powers that were given to the CHO, they're fairly they're wide ranging, but they're quite specific. They're about preventing movement. They're about quarantining people. They're about forcing businesses and things to shut down. But, they don't give rights of entry and right to take over property and things like that, like the disaster declaration does. Now, here's the thing. These two pieces of legislation were the intent when they were set up, and this is a good thing for people to remember, that legislation is not necessarily used for what it was intended for. The medical emergency declaration, originally, if you go back to Hansard and look at when it was introduced, and it was introduced by Daniel Andrews, by the way, in case you didn't know that, when he was health minister way back in 2008, I think. But it was all around HIV, and there was cases where there was people intentionally who had HIV who were intentionally infecting other people. And they wanted powers to stop them doing that. And that's what it was all about, stopping movement of these people. And that was one of and the other thing that they were talking about was Legionnaire's disease in building tower air conditioning systems and stuff like that. And, being able to shut down a building so that you can force them to clean the air conditioning system and things like that. There wasn't a lot of discussion about the current situation, but, here we are. And with the disaster declaration, they were talking about, the reason that they were going to be able to commandeer property and take over property. Oh, we lost Ash. Was all around, if you need to access someone's pool for firefighting, right? You can just take their water, or if someone's got firefighting equipment on their property, you can just take it and use it. That sort of was the thinking around it, I think. And so they haven't used any of the powers for seizing property yet, but I don't know what they might use them for, but they've got those powers now. But yes, it can go. So the disaster declaration's just been declared, and that can go for a maximum of 6 months, and it can't go longer than that without some new legislation, which they may do.
Then the health one couldn't go more than 6 months either. So now they brought this disaster one in just before the health one ran out.
Yeah.
You can always go to a new health disaster at the end of that.
Well, I don't know. I think we have to look at that. But yeah, I'm not sure how that works. But yeah, it maybe, I don't know.
So hang on.
Enabling
so there was one here. I think I'll answer it because it's we've got another staffer who's running our tech stuff behind the scenes, and he dug up the answer to Alex's question, and I'm not sure exactly what legislation they're referring to, but it was around invoking Section 8A, and I think it was a motion of no confidence in the government or something. And the answer to your question there, Alex, is that Tim and David can't do that because that motion has to be introduced in the other chamber, in the Legislative Assembly. So it's not an option that's available for either David or Tim. There was another question from Alex around the independence of the CHO. Just sort of, I think what they're getting at here is whether the advice that the Chief Health Officer is providing to the government is truly independent, or whether there's a feedback loop from the government and the Chief Health Officer there. Do you have any thoughts on that?
We don't know. I mean, we don't see those discussions and things, but obviously they talk to each other and there must be some sort of interaction and things like that and feedback between each other. But, we'd only be speculating, I think.
It would probably be defamatory for me to say that the CHO does what the government tells him to. It's interesting to note that when things were bad, it was all CHO told us this, CHO told us that. When the Premier thought we're on top of it all, it was suddenly, I've decided this, I'm doing that. And now all of a sudden it's all back to CHO again. So read from that what you will.
There was another question here. Do you know what is really driving the huge numbers in Melbourne, even after weeks of lockdown? Do you think that there might be some way it's spreading that the government knows about, but are not letting it be known publicly? So I don't know if you've got any thoughts about that and the nature of the spread.
I don't know. Like, it's too much. It's too much for the department to keep track of, let alone us. I mean, I don't know what's causing it all. I mean, I know that, you know, the largest outbreak that we saw was based around quarantine and it sort of spread from there. But I mean, there's been other events as well that have happened. You know, there was some problems with communicating with some groups, and they just weren't aware that they weren't meant to meet and stuff. And, you know, there was problems there too. But, you know, was there any one single problem? Probably not. There's a whole bunch of factors, I think, that are driving all of this. But I mean, clearly the disease is quite contagious and, yeah, sinister in the way it can be spread without any symptoms, which makes it very difficult to control, clearly.
We've talked a lot about the virus and the government response. So maybe just to break it up for a bit, somebody asked early on about the airsoft bill, Tim, if you want to break it up. They've been hanging out a while. Hopefully they're still there waiting for an answer to that one.
Well, the trouble is we don't know what's happened to our timetable with Parliament suspended indefinitely again. We don't know. We have a couple of slots. We get 4 slots a year, 2 each, to introduce stuff. We already lost one of our slots this year. It's been pushed into next year. David was supposed to have a slot tomorrow, but that's not happening. So everything will get pushed further down the timetable. The government's talking about having extra sittings when we can sit again to catch everything up. We'll see what happens there. We've drafted an airsoft bill. It's it's in the drafting office. We've drawn it up. There's work is going on. We will be launching a campaign to people to lobby MPs of it in the months going forward. I think that's all taking place now. We have some groups getting together and pushing that. You can probably find out more about that on my Facebook page in the next few days. But anyway, that campaign is being put together. A bill's there. It will be pushed forward in the next 12 months. Hopefully we'll see a bill in the Parliament. Don't hold your breath for it to pass. If people push hard enough and lobby hard enough, the government might decide why the hell not. We'll see where it goes. So certainly it's a priority for me. It's just we don't know how far down the pilot's been pushed now, but we'll get to it.
And for you, David, it's like deja vu. It was 2 days ago. I was moderating a live stream with yourself and Dr. Colin Mendelsohn around vaping, anticipating your motion this week for vaping. So where does that sit now?
Yeah, so look, it's still going to go ahead. We don't know exactly when. I'm not, I would have liked to have gone ahead with the debate tomorrow, but that's, clearly not going to happen now. I want to get it in before December 31st because that's when that nicotine import ban is meant to come into effect. And I think we need to have this discussion before that. So, yeah, I'd like to have it in before then, but, who knows what's going to happen with Parliament and the pandemic and everything. I'd be crazy to try and predict that. So, and there's a whole bunch of other stuff that we want to do as well that has been delayed. So yeah, but we're still going ahead with other things. So, next week I'm going to be very busy next week because I've not only got the Public Accounts and Estimates Committee where we're going to be asking the government and the public service about and other groups about about the government's response to the pandemic. But on Friday next week, we've also got the nuclear inquiry, which is going to be great. So that's one that was put up by me and Tim on nuclear prohibition in Victoria. So that'll be really interesting. So Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday next week, I'm doing PAYAC, and then Friday we're doing the nuclear prohibition inquiry. So that'll be fun. I'm really looking forward to both.
I have an inquiry into road safety going on at the moment. We've just had one into expanding the free tram zone in Melbourne, which I'm not a fan of, but obviously a whole bunch of people are. A lot of people like free stuff, although surprisingly enough, quite a few people didn't like the idea of more free tram zone. So anyway, we're looking at road safety now, which I'm suggesting we need to raise speed limits on the Hume Freeway and other dual lane carriageways. Most people seem to think we should cut the speed limits everywhere to 4 k's an hour, probably. Anyway, stuff going on, yes. Yeah,
so there's still stuff going on, as we said, so that's good. And you look, as always, if you live in our area, or even if you don't live in our area, you can always reach out to our office. We've got a great team. Ash is one of them, who will try and answer your questions or help you out as best we can. We get all sorts of contacts about all sorts of issues, and we don't mind having a go at everything. But we can't do everything, but we'll certainly try. And I know Tim's the same. He's been getting lots of contacts as well from people in his area about various issues. But one of the things that we can do is help point you in the right direction. And if you need clarification on something, we can probably help out there. And in certain cases, we can bring things up in Parliament. There's been a number of people that have contacted us, small businesses and things like this that have had issues that they want brought up in Parliament. We don't mind doing that if it's in line with our principles.
Parliament's got to sit first.
Parliament's got to sit first, but there are still some other mechanisms. So there is one mechanism called a question on notice, where you can send in questions when Parliament's not running and still get answers, which can be helpful for some things. So there's still things that you can do.
There was an example of this kind of thing in one of the comments. Somebody, if I'm remembering correctly, they live in Glen Iris, or they live in Wheelers Hill, and they're chiropractors in another suburb, and they were asking if they could still travel there. I think the answer is yes, because it's for healthcare, but that's exactly the kind of question that, if you're confused about what your business can do, what you can do, how you can access support, just email Tim or David's office. They'll get one of the staff in either office to help you out with that kind of thing. And I think I can speak for everyone in David's office. Like we love helping people out to if we can help somebody solve a problem, we'll get a real kick out of that.
Yeah, definitely. I should seize the opportunity to plug Rexit. I wouldn't be wrong of me not to do so. The Rexit, the idea that the regions of Victoria should break away and form a new state, or better still, new states. I'm pushing for a new state of Murray or Riverina with a southern New South Wales and northern Victoria. We want to get away from all you plague rats. We want to be able to make our own decisions for ourselves, made by people who understand our local industries and local economies. And I think it's well overdue. And I think the anger from this whole lockdown and shut up COVID thing is going to probably give it a big boost, actually. So see Brexit coming to a place near you soon.
There's a few other questions there that are the kinds of things that I think are just typical with the confusion that's going on, like whether this certain thing is allowed or that certain thing is allowed. I think rather than try and answer every little question, I'd just invite David or Tim if you've got any final comments.
Tim can go first.
Yeah, maybe just reflecting on where we are, what the government's current approach has been in the last 24 hours, and where you hope we can go next.
You really faded out there. Government authoritarian approach not working, so they doubled down on it. We've now got to go through. No, they're not going to change. It doesn't matter what we say or do. They're going to keep pushing this harder. So we just got to go through the next 6 weeks or 8 weeks or 10 weeks of lockdown, however long. We'll get out the other side of it eventually, I guess. One day the Parliament will sit again. We will keep pushing these things forward.
Yeah, look, people are hurting. Everyone's hurting. They're telling us that they're hurting, and we're listening to that. We're doing our best to fight for these people, especially small businesses. We've just seen it's heartbreaking what you see. People have built these businesses that have been their life, and to see them just stomped on by government is really heartbreaking to see, not just for the owners, but for their workers and their customers and all these people that they're trying to help. And we're fighting that, these restrictions shouldn't be there for a second longer than they need to be. They need to be rational and proportionate to the risks that we're seeing. We think that they've gone too far with a lot of these restrictions, and we thought they'd gone too far already. And these extra restrictions now, when we've got things like, quotas for meat production in abattoirs. I mean, we're talking about central planning now. Like this is crazy. And government trying to analyse supply chains and things like this. We know central planning doesn't work. This is just not sustainable. It's not going to end well if they continue this. There has to be a different way of doing this. And I'd encourage anyone out there to encourage the government or encourage your fellow citizens to think about other ways that we could be doing this other than a great big stick.
All right. I think we'll leave it there unless you got a final comment there, Tim.
I was just going to say it, hard times ahead. Even when we get out of this, there's going to be a recession or a depression. You can't just kickstart the economy. Businesses will be broken. Anyway, we all know it's happening. The government probably doesn't quite realise the extent of it because they are also central planners and don't understand you can't just restart things again. But it'll be what it'll be.
All right, I think we'll leave it there for this evening. We'll probably do more of these live streams, I guess, especially, during the hard lockdown.
With no Parliament.
Yeah, and I think for David and Tim, there's, in normal circumstances, there's an opportunity to meet people at events, to speak to constituents, hear from their views. So this is an opportunity for both of them as well to hear from you guys. So thank you for showing up to the live feed. Thanks for all of your questions. If there was something important that we didn't get to, you can find David and Tim's details online, send an email through to the office, and we'll respond there. So thanks, everybody. And thanks to our guests, Tim Quilty, member for the Legislative Council in the Northern Metro region for the Liberal Democrats, David Limbrick, member for the Southeast Metropolitan region in the Legislative Council.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Yeah.